A man's destiny can change with a single decision. In the dusty streets of Jerusalem, under the weight of the Roman Empire, a prefect was writing his name in the pages of history. Pontius Pilate, the man who washed his hands before the crowd while delivering Jesus of Nazareth to crucifixion, never imagined that this gesture would haunt him until his last breath. This is the story of how power, cowardice, and remorse can destroy even the most powerful. In the year 26 after Christ, a man of Italian origin arrived in the arid lands of Judea. Pontius Pilate, a member of the Roman equestrian order, had been appointed fifth prefect of this conflictive province by Emperor Tiberius. With the characteristic pride of an imperial official, Pilate established his official residence in Caesarea Maritima, 100 kilometers from Jerusalem, visiting the Holy City only during important Jewish festivities. As prefect, Pontius Pilate had the responsibility of maintaining law and order in Judea, a task that included the administration of justice and tax collection. His judicial authority gave him the power to dictate death sentences, a prerogative he used in the case of Jesus, condemning him for treason. This judicial power was his main tool for keeping control of a province where religious and political tensions constantly threatened peace. From the beginning, Pilate showed little tact in governing a people so attached to their religious traditions. Shortly after taking office, he provoked the anger of the Jews by introducing standards with the bust of Emperor Tiberius into Jerusalem, considered idols by the locals. The protest was such that he finally had to yield and remove them. On another occasion, he used money from the temple to build an aqueduct, which sparked new protests that were harshly repressed by his soldiers. The years of Pilate's government were marked by constant tensions with the local population. King Herod Antipas said of Pilate that he was a man venal, violent, rapacious, extortive, and tyrannical. However, between the governor and the tetrarch, there existed a deep enmity, fueled by political intrigues and power struggles. Each watched the other's movements, fearing conspiracies and betrayals. Pilate's figure moved between shadows of ambition and pragmatism, an official who sought to ascend in the imperial hierarchy while governing a province he despised, a man who failed to understand the depth of the beliefs of those he governed, and thus, without knowing it, he was heading toward the moment that would define his life and legacy, the trial of a Galilean preacher named Jesus of Nazareth. It was the eve of the Jewish Passover in the year 33. The streets of Jerusalem bustled with pilgrims who had come from everywhere to celebrate the most important holiday in the Hebrew calendar. Pontius Pilate, as was his custom during these dates, had moved from Caesarea Maritima to the Antonia fortress, adjacent to the temple, to personally supervise security during the celebrations. That morning, the guards brought before him a prisoner whose name had already reached his ears, Jesus of Nazareth, a Galilean preacher whose teachings caused a stir among the population and concern among the Jewish religious authorities. According to the Christian Gospels, Jesus was arrested and brought before the Sanhedrin, the assembly of Jewish elders and priests, who accused him of heresy and violating the Sabbath law. However, it was the accusation of proclaiming himself King of the Jews that led to his trial before Pilate, as this represented a direct threat to Roman rule. During the trial, several passages are famous, such as the episode in which Pontius Pilate speaks to Jesus, and seeing that he did not utter a word, says to him, "Don't you answer me? Don't you know that I can crucify you or set you free?" Component placement, to which Christ responded, "You would have no power over me if it had not been given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you has committed a greater sin." Pilate found himself in an uncomfortable position. On one hand, he found no fault in that silent man who stood before him. On the other, the Jewish religious leaders pressed vehemently for him to be executed, threatening disturbances that could reach the emperor's ears. Pilate found himself between a rock and a hard place, so tired and disgusted with the case and those who promoted it, not knowing what to do, he ended it with a legal procedure, valid for the provinces of the empire, found in the Lex Julia, called Extraordinaria Cognitio. Also famous is the moment when Pontius Pilate, who had ordered the flagellation of Jesus before his execution, to distance himself from any responsibility for his death, lets the Jewish people decide between freeing a dangerous prisoner named Barabbas or freeing Christ. The crowd, instigated by the priests, chose to free Barabbas. Then, in a gesture that would go down in history, Pilate asked for water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this just man's blood. It is your responsibility." With this symbolic act, he tried to exempt himself from moral responsibility for the death of a man he himself considered innocent. But the gesture would not erase his guilt before history, nor before his own conscience in the years to come. After the crucifixion of Jesus, Pontius Pilate continued with his functions as prefect of Judea. However, something had changed in him. Witnesses of the time reported that the governor had become more taciturn, more prone to outbursts of anger, and more severe in his punishments. Rumors about strange events following the death of the Nazarene ran through the streets of Jerusalem. There was talk of an eclipse, an earthquake, open tombs, and testimonies of terrified guards who claimed to have seen the empty tomb. Pilate ordered such rumors to be silenced, but he could not silence the voices that rose, proclaiming that the one he had condemned had risen on the third day. During the following years, Pilate governed with an increasingly harsh hand. His relationship with the local population deteriorated constantly, and his methods became more cruel. Each revolt was crushed with extreme violence, each protest drowned in blood. The prefect, who had once hesitated to condemn an innocent man, now showed no such scruples. Pilate's nights became restless. Servants at his residence in Caesarea Maritima told that the governor often woke up screaming, with his face covered in cold sweat. Some claimed to have heard him mumble about hands that never came clean, about innocent blood that could not be washed away. His wife, Claudia Procula, who according to tradition had had a premonitory dream before Jesus' trial and had warned her husband to have nothing to do with that just man, now saw how her husband was consumed day by day. The distance between them grew as Pilate increasingly shut himself away, tormented by memories he could not erase. In the circles of power in Rome, Pilate's reputation also began to deteriorate. Reports about his government reached Emperor Tiberius, and they were not favorable. There was talk of his excessive cruelty, his inability to keep peace without resorting to extreme violence, his growing unpopularity among the Jews. The shadow of failure began to loom over the ambitious prefect's career. 3 years had passed since the crucifixion of Jesus, and the situation in Judea remained tense. The last episode of Pilate's life that has reached us dates back to the years 35 and 36. The place was Samaria, and the facts are that a man, described as a demagogue and a liar, gathered a crowd of faithful and encouraged them to go to Mount Gerizim, near the city of Samaria, and sacred according to popular traditions. This leader promised to show sacred relics supposedly buried by Moses on that mountain. The promise attracted numerous followers who gathered armed at the foot of the mountain. For Pilate, whose paranoia had grown over the years, this had all the ingredients of an insurrection. He did not hesitate to send his troops to quell what he considered the beginning of a rebellion. Pilate anticipated, occupying the promontory with heavily armed troops, attacked them successfully, killing some and putting the rest to flight. Then the repression began. Many of those who had participated in the gathering were captured and executed. The violence of the response was disproportionate, even by Roman standards of the time. News of the massacre quickly reached the higher authorities. Pontius Pilate was relieved of command of Judea in the year 36, after harshly repressing a revolt by the Samaritans, during which he crucified several troublemakers. The Samaritan leaders had sent a delegation to Vitellius, the legate of Syria, Pilate's hierarchical superior, to denounce the prefect's cruelty. Vitellius heard the accusations and considered that Pilate had exceeded his authority. The order was clear. The prefect had to leave his post and return to Rome to give explanations directly to Emperor Tiberius. After 10 years governing Judea, Pontius Pilate was dismissed in disgrace. When the imperial messengers arrived in Caesarea with the order of dismissal, they found a Pilate very different from the proud official who had arrived in Judea a decade earlier. His face showed the traces of sleepless nights. His gaze reflected the weight of decisions he could not undo. Without resistance, he obeyed the order and began preparations for his journey back to Rome. The news of his dismissal spread quickly throughout Judea. Many celebrated the fall of the cruel governor, especially among those who had suffered his harsh hand. Others, mainly Roman collaborators, feared for their own future without Pilate's protection. Meanwhile, in the Christian circles that were beginning to form secretly, some saw in these events the hand of divine justice. The spring of the year 37 had arrived when Pontius Pilate embarked for Rome. He left behind a decade of government in Judea, a province he had never understood, and that now expelled him in disgrace. The Mediterranean Sea, normally clement at that time of year, was agitated, like a reflection of the storm that was unleashing inside the deposed prefect. During the long journey, Pilate had time to reflect on his career, on the decisions he had made, on the paths that had led him to that moment. But a recurring thought returned again and again to his mind, the image of that silent man, with serene eyes and deep gaze, who had remained dignified even in the face of torture and death. The man whose blood he had tried to wash from his hands with a useless gesture. When the ship finally arrived at the port of Ostia, near Rome, Pilate received the news that would seal his fate. Emperor Tiberius had died weeks before, on March 16th, and Caligula had assumed power. The only reliable fact is that by the year 40 he must have already died, or at least been reduced to silence, and the information vacuum has been filled with legends and apocrypha. According to a tradition collected by Eusebius, Pontius Pilate fell into disgrace under the empire of Caligula and ended up committing suicide. Other versions indicate that he was banished to Gaul, present-day France, where he spent his last days in anonymity and shame. The truth is that, upon arriving in Rome, Pilate found that his former protectors had fallen from grace or had died, and the new emperor had no interest in hearing the justifications of a mid-ranking official accused of excessive cruelty. The audiences he requested were denied, doors that once opened for him now closed. For weeks, Pilate wandered the streets of Rome like a shadow of himself. His fortune dwindled, his former friends avoided him, his name began to be forgotten. Finally, the imperial order came. Pontius Pilate was banished to Vienne in Gaul, far from the capital and any possibility of recovering his position. The journey into exile was lonely and bitter. Pilate's wife, Claudia Procula, had decided not to accompany him, preferring to remain in Rome. According to some traditions, she would have secretly embraced the Christian faith, impacted by the events she had witnessed in Jerusalem and by her own premonitory dreams. Thus, the man who had once held power over life and death in Judea now headed alone toward an uncertain fate in distant lands, carrying with him only the weight of his remorse and the echo of a question he had never answered. What is truth? The cold lands of Gaul received Pontius Pilate with indifference. Vienne, a Roman city on the banks of the Rhone River, would be his prison without walls during the last years of his life. Gone were the days of glory, power, servants ready to fulfill his orders. Now he was just a prematurely aged man who inhabited a modest house on the outskirts of the city, subsisting on the scarce resources he had managed to save from his fall from grace. The inhabitants of Vienne barely paid attention to that taciturn foreigner. Few knew he had been prefect of Judea, and even fewer knew his role in the crucifixion of the Nazarene prophet. For most, he was simply another political exile, one of the many that Rome dispersed through the provinces when they fell from imperial grace. The days in exile succeeded each other with monotonous slowness. Pilate spent hours contemplating the waters of the Rhone, wondering if he would ever return to Rome, if his name would be rehabilitated, if there would be some way to redeem himself before history. But in the depths of his heart, he knew that the judgment of posterity had already been dictated. At night, dreams tormented him. He saw accusing faces, heard cries of pain, felt the weight of all the lives he had reaped in his eagerness to maintain order and please his superiors. And always, at the center of these nightmares, appeared the serene figure of the one who had died on the cross, looking at him not with hatred, but with a compassion that was even more unbearable. Over the years, Pilate's health deteriorated. The humid climate of Gaul did not help his tired bones, and loneliness weighed on his spirit like a slab. Occasionally, some traveler from Judea brought news of that distant province. It was thus that Pilate learned of the growth of the sect of the followers of the Nazarene, whom they called Christians. With amazement, he heard how those whom he had persecuted and whose leader he had delivered to death now multiplied despite the persecutions. One afternoon, a Jewish merchant passing through Vienne recognized the ex-prefect. During a brief conversation, he told Pilate about the wonders attributed to the followers of Jesus, about their secret meetings, about how they shared their goods and cared for the most needy. The merchant also mentioned that those Christians included Pilate's name in their prayers, not as a curse, but as part of their creed, suffered under the power of Pontius Pilate. That night, the ex-prefect could not sleep. The idea that his name would endure forever, linked to that of the one he had condemned, filled him with a strange fear. Was this a form of divine justice? A punishment more subtle and lasting than exile or death, or perhaps an invitation to reflection, to finally understand what was that truth he had disdained? In his 6th year of exile, Pilate received the unexpected visit of a former centurion who had served under his command in Judea. The military man, now retired and established in Gaul, had heard rumors about the ex-prefect's presence in Vienne and had decided to look for him. That meeting momentarily returned Pilate to his past, to the days when his word was law and Roman soldiers executed his orders without questioning them. The centurion brought with him not only memories, but also news from Judea, and what proved more disturbing for Pilate, accounts of the miracles attributed to Jesus during his ministry in Galilee. Stories that the prefect had never heard in detail: blind people who regained their sight, paralytics who walked again, sick people who were healed just by touching his cloak, and most amazing, testimonies of people who claimed to have seen him alive after his crucifixion. "I saw him die, sir," said the centurion with a grave voice. "I was at the foot of the cross. I saw him exhale his last breath. I saw how the soldier pierced his side with the spear. No one survives that." He paused before continuing. "But 3 days later, when we were guarding the tomb sealed by your order, something happened. There was a tremor, a blinding light. When we regained consciousness, the stone had been removed and the body was no longer there. Many of my men swore they had seen heavenly messengers." Pilate listened, with a mixture of disbelief and fascination. He remembered the report about the disappearance of the body, but had attributed it to a theft perpetrated by the followers of the Nazarene. Now, listening to this veteran Roman soldier, a pragmatic man little given to superstitions, doubts began to assail him. "What do you believe?" he finally asked. The centurion was silent for a few moments, as if carefully weighing his answer. "I believe, sir, that on that day at Golgotha, we did not execute a simple carpenter from Galilee, nor a political agitator. I believe there was something more in him, something we could not understand then." After the centurion's departure, Pilate was plunged into a deep disquiet. The soldier's words resonated in his mind, along with memories of the trial, the serenity of the accused, his dignified silence, his strange declaration about truth. What if he had really condemned someone extraordinary? What if that preacher was more than he appeared? For days, the ex-prefect searched his memories for every detail of that brief encounter with Jesus. He recalled his own perplexity at the attitude of the accused, so different from other prisoners he had judged. He recalled how he had tried to free him, convinced of his innocence, and he recalled, above all, that useless gesture of washing his hands, as if water could clean the responsibility from his soul. For the first time in years, Pilate began to wonder if there was something beyond the material life he had always known. if there were forces that escaped human understanding, if that Galilean preacher had been right in speaking of a kingdom that was not of this world. The 7th winter of Pilate in exile was particularly harsh. The incessant rains, the cold that penetrated to the bone, the increasingly oppressive loneliness, everything contributed to aggravate his mood, already somber in itself. His health, deteriorated by the years and hardships, barely allowed him to leave home on the most inclement days. During those long days of forced seclusion, Pilate began to write his memoirs, not as an exercise in vanity or an attempt at justification before posterity, but as a way to exorcise the ghosts that haunted him. Page after page, he recounted his career, his ambitions, his achievements, his failures, and, inevitably, he came to the moment that had defined his life, the trial of Jesus of Nazareth. In writing down those events, Pilate faced for the first time the true dimension of his responsibility. He could no longer shield himself in the pressure of the crowd, in the veiled threats of the priests, in the reason of state. The naked truth emerged from his own words. He had knowingly condemned an innocent man, had yielded out of cowardice, political calculation, fear of losing his position. "I could have freed him," he wrote with a trembling hand. "I had the power to do it. I knew he was innocent. I knew it from the first moment I saw him. There was something in his eyes, a light, a certainty, a peace that disturbed me. He asked me what truth was, and I, who considered myself a cultured man, a representative of Roman civilization, did not know what to answer. Perhaps because deep down, I knew that the truth was in front of me, and I did not have the courage to recognize it." That night, after writing these lines, Pilate experienced a crisis that shook his body and soul. Fever consumed him, while in his delirium he saw pass before his eyes all the faces of those he had harmed in his desire for power, the Jews massacred for protesting against the imperial standards, the Samaritans executed on Mount Gerizim, and always, at the end, the serene and bloodied face of Jesus with the crown of thorns. For days, Pilate debated between life and death, attended barely by the elderly woman who served as his housekeeper. The fever finally subsided, but the man who emerged from that crisis was no longer the same. Something had been definitively broken inside him, but also something new had begun to germinate. One morning, upon waking from his convalescence, Pilate took his memoirs and tore up the pages full of self-justifications. In their place, he wrote a single phrase: "Truth cannot be washed from the hands." It was the beginning of a long and painful path toward recognizing his guilt, the first step toward possible redemption. The 8th year of exile brought with it an encounter that would change the last days of Pontius Pilate. One spring afternoon, while taking one of his usual walks along the banks of the Rhone, he observed an elderly man who seemed to be studying him with interest. He was not one of the local inhabitants, and his appearance revealed an Eastern origin. After several days, in which their paths crossed casually, the stranger finally approached Pilate. He introduced himself as Nicodemus, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the same council that had brought Jesus before the Roman prefect years earlier. Pilate vaguely remembered that name. It was said he had been a secret follower of the Nazarene, who had provided the spices for his embalming. "Have you come to seek revenge?" Pilate asked bitterly. "I've come to seek the man who washed his hands," Nicodemus replied calmly. "I've come because we both share a guilt. You condemned him for fear of losing your position. I did not have the courage to defend him openly when I could have done so." That meeting marked the beginning of long conversations between two men united by guilt and repentance. Nicodemus related to Pilate the events following the crucifixion, the resurrection on the 3rd day, the appearances to the disciples, the formation of the first communities of followers, the persecutions they were already beginning to suffer. "I have lived long enough to see how his message spreads, despite all attempts to silence it," explained the elderly Jew. "Those who once fled terrified now preach without fear. Those who doubted are now willing to die for what they have seen. Something extraordinary happened in that tomb, Pilate, something that changes everything." The ex-prefect listened with growing attention. Nicodemus's words resonated with the centurion's accounts, with his own presentiments, with the doubts that had tormented him for years. "Why have you come to look for me?" he finally asked. "Because he taught us to forgive," Nicodemus replied, "because his last words on the cross were, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do.' And I believe he was referring to you too, Pilate." Those words fell like lightning upon the ex-prefect. The idea of forgiveness was completely alien to his Roman mentality, where justice was based on retribution, on punishment proportional to the crime committed. How could someone, at the moment of his maximum suffering, ask forgiveness for his executioners? During the following weeks, Nicodemus shared with Pilate the teachings of Jesus, the accounts of his miracles, the parables with which he illustrated his message. He spoke to him of the kingdom that was not of this world, of the truth that makes men free, of love of neighbor as the supreme commandment. Slowly, in the hardened heart of the ex-prefect, a crack began to open through which a new light filtered. For the first time in his life, Pilate began to glimpse something beyond the power, ambition, and pride that had guided his steps. The idea of forgiveness, so foreign to his Roman upbringing, began to resonate in the depths of his being. Before departing, Nicodemus gave Pilate a small scroll containing accounts of the life and teachings of Jesus. "Read this," he told him, "and ask yourself, as he asked you, what is truth?" That night, by the light of an oil lamp, the ex-prefect began to read the texts that years later would be known as Gospels. The words of the one he had condemned now returned to him, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." The 9th year of exile witnessed a different Pilate. The encounter with Nicodemus had awakened in him a spiritual restlessness he had never experienced before. The practical man, the efficient administrator, the calculating politician, now wondered about questions that went beyond the tangible. He began to write letters, some addressed to former acquaintances in Rome, others to the few friends he had left in Judea. In these missives, Pilate reflected on his life, on his mistakes, on that trial that had marked his destiny. He no longer tried to justify himself. For the first time, he fully accepted his responsibility. "I have governed provinces, I have commanded legions, I have dictated sentences of life and death," he wrote in one of these letters. "But I never understood what true power was until I saw a man go voluntarily to death with no hatred in his heart. That man had a power that I, with all the authority of Rome behind me, could never understand." In another missive, addressed to a former subordinate now serving in Syria, Pilate recalled the crucial moment. "When he asked me if I was saying he was king on my own, or because others had told me, I didn't know what to answer. Now I understand the depth of his question. All my life I had acted according to what others expected of me, my superiors, the emperor, public opinion. I never asked myself what was right, what was the truth, and when the truth was in front of me, I washed my hands." Some of these letters reached their destination, others were lost on the way. Over time, some would be copied and distributed among the first Christian communities, who saw in them valuable testimony. Centuries later, apocryphal documents would emerge claiming to be letters from Pilate, perhaps inspired by these authentic writings, but elaborated for diverse purposes. The truth is that through his correspondence, Pilate was making an inner journey much more significant than all his travels as an imperial official. He was traveling the path from pride to humility, from justification to repentance. One afternoon he received an unexpected response. Claudia Procula, his wife, who had remained in Rome after his banishment, wrote to him after years of silence. In her letter, she revealed that she too had been touched by the story of the Nazarene, that the premonitory dream she had before Jesus' trial had changed her life. "I should have insisted more," wrote Claudia. "I should have shouted louder that you have nothing to do with that just man. But now I know that everything had to happen that way. His death was not the end, but the beginning. And perhaps your role in this story, although painful, had a purpose that we are only now beginning to glimpse." Those words deeply moved Pilate. For the first time in years, he felt that he was not alone in his search. that even his greatest failure could have meaning within a greater plan that he could not completely understand. Pilate's 10th winter in exile was particularly severe. Snow covered the roofs of Vienne, and the Rhone River dragged blocks of ice. The relentless cold seeped through the cracks of the ex-prefect's modest house, whose deteriorated health barely allowed him to keep warm. At 65, Pilate felt that life was escaping him. The recurring fevers, the cough that would not cease, the pain in the joints. Everything indicated that his time in this world was coming to an end. Gone were the days of glory in Rome, the power in Judea, even the bitterness of the first years of exile. Now, in the solitude of his bed, the ex-prefect contemplated his life with a clarity that only the proximity of death can grant. One night, as the storm lashed the shutters of his window, Pilate took a small roll of parchment and began to write what would be his final testimony. It was not a defense or a justification, but the sincere confession of a man who had finally understood. I, Pontius Pilate, who was prefect of Judea under the reign of Emperor Tiberius, write these words as my final testimony. I have thought many times about that Friday of Passover in Jerusalem, when a man called Jesus of Nazareth was brought before me to be judged. I found no fault in him, and yet I delivered him to be crucified. I washed my hands before the crowd, believing that with that gesture I freed myself from responsibility. How wrong I was. For years, I have tried to wash that guilt from my conscience, but water cannot clean what is engraved on the soul. I have lived long enough to see how the message of the one I condemned spreads throughout the empire, how men and women are willing to die for his name, how his teachings transform lives. And I wonder, what power is that which not even death can stop? He asked me, what is truth? I did not know how to answer him then. Now, at the end of my life, I believe I begin to understand. Truth is not a concept, an idea, a philosophy. Truth is a person, and I had it before me and I did not recognize it. If these words reach those who follow him, know that Pontius Pilate, in his last days, understood the magnitude of his error and the greatness of the one he condemned. And if there is forgiveness for someone like me, may the God he called Father have mercy on my soul. As he wrote these lines, tears rolled down the old man's cheeks. Upon finishing, he felt as if an immense weight lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in decades, Pontius Pilate experienced something that resembled peace. Spring came to Vienne, but Pontius Pilate did not live to see it. On a cold morning at the end of winter, the ex-prefect of Judea was found lifeless in his bed. His face, marked by years and sufferings, showed a serenity he had rarely known in life. About his final message, there are various versions. According to some traditions, the parchment was discovered next to his body and subsequently delivered to Christian travelers passing through the region. Other sources claim that Pilate had entrusted his testimony to a former slave who had remained loyal to him during the years of exile, with instructions to deliver it to the communities of followers of Jesus. The truth is that Pilate's death was not the end of his story. Over time, diverse legends would arise about his last days and his possible conversion to Christianity. The popular imagination, always active, would weave stories where divine justice, redemption, and repentance intertwine in diverse forms. One of these legends, which the Christians of Ethiopia and Egypt came to consider truthful, claimed that Pilate had embraced faith in Christ and had died as a martyr. This tradition even assigned him the condition of saint, celebrating his feast day on June 25th. Other versions, more somber, spoke of a suicide motivated by desperation and remorse. According to Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the first historians of the church, Pilate fell into so many misfortunes that he was forced to be his own executioner and to punish his own criminal hand. Divine justice, it seems, did not delay in reaching him. A particularly dramatic tradition related that Pilate's body, first thrown into the Tiber River in Rome, had caused such storms that it had to be removed and taken to the Rhone. There, the same disturbances would have forced the remains to be transferred to an alpine lake, where they would finally find rest. But beyond these legends, The truth is that the name of Pontius Pilate would forever be linked to that of Jesus of Nazareth. Millions of Christians throughout the centuries would recite in their creed that Christ suffered under the power of Pontius Pilate, converting the Roman prefect into an involuntary historical reference of the faith that would be born from the death and resurrection of the one he condemned. Pilate's story is, in a way, a mirror in which each generation has seen reflected its own weaknesses: the temptation to yield to the pressure of the crowd, the fear of losing position and prestige, the moral cowardice of seeking easy ways out of difficult decisions. His gesture of washing his hands would become a universal symbol of one who attempts to evade responsibility. But it is also, perhaps, a story of possible redemption, of the human capacity to recognize one's errors and seek forgiveness, even at the end of the road, when everything seems lost. In this sense, Pilate's destiny reminds us that the final word on our lives is not determined by our failures, but by the truth we finally decide to embrace.